Hey there, folks. Chuck Holton. Happy Monday to you. Being a journalist is sort of all about aggregation of data. What I mean by that is that there's so much information out there, and there's so many different worldviews. Everybody's got their spin on the data that is there. Part of my job as a journalist is to try to sift through the mountains of information about the subject at hand and try to bring you as close to an unbiased report of just what is true as I can. So, for example, when you talk about Ukraine, the Ukrainians say that the Russians have lost 38,000 troops killed, and the real number is probably closer to maybe 15,000. More unbiased sources like the United Kingdom's security service and people like that you can listen to, who probably will have a little bit less biased view of the numbers. Now, of course, Russia won't disclose the numbers of their lost, and neither does Ukraine on a regular basis. They want to use that information as ammunition in their information war. So we're always under information war. We're always subject to information war from both sides. And part of the difficulty of being a journalist in this day and age is sifting through this information and trying to figure out what's true. Now, there's a annual conference called the Aspen Security Forum. It takes place in Aspen, Colorado, and it brings together a lot of the kind of biggest names in international relations. That could be everybody from the head of the United Nations to the head of NATO to the head of the CIA. And at this year's conference that they just had last week, they had Bill Burns, the CIA director, on, and he was interviewed by a lady from NBC that talked, and they were talking about Ukraine. Now, this went on for almost an hour, but I went through the information, listened to the whole interview, and there were some very key points that I think Bill Burns had to say about about the war in Ukraine. And I think that as far as a trustworthy source goes, there are obviously things he can't say. Bill Burns works for the Biden administration, so you have to take that into account. But I think as far as finding a diplomat in today's day and age in the United States who is nonpartisan, Bill Burns is probably about as close as you could get. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything he says is not going to be colored by the party line. It will be. But I think that as he said in his testimony during his confirmation hearings, that the CIA director should be as nonpartisan as possible, and I think he does strive to do that. And I think the fact that he was confirmed by a unanimous vote in the Senate says a lot about the fact that he does a good job at that. He's been around for a long time. He speaks 4 languages, Russian being one of them. He was the ambassador to the Russian Federation. So he understands Russia about as well as anybody could outside of Russia. And I think it bears listening to what he has to say.
With Vladimir Putin's meeting in Iran with the Ayatollah Khomeini, who praised Putin's invasion of Ukraine and said, if you had not taken the helm, the other side would have done so and initiated a war. The other side meaning NATO, of course. What are the implications of this new, stronger alliance of adversaries?
Well, again, it's great to be with all of you. I mean, I must admit that watching the images of President Putin and Iran's supreme leader meeting yesterday in Tehran did not exactly fill me with nostalgia, because most of the gray hair on top of my head came from negotiating with Russians and Iranians over the years. I mean, I think beneath the images that we all saw, the reality is that Russians and Iranians need each other right now. both heavily sanctioned countries, both looking to break out of political isolation as well. But if they need each other, they don't really trust each other in the sense that they're energy rivals and historical competitors. So it's true that the Russians are reaching out to the Iranians to try to acquire armed drones, UAVs. It's important, I think, for us to remember or to remind ourselves when we look at that prospect that the purpose of those drones is to kill Ukrainian civilians in a brutal and unprovoked war of aggression. It's also important to remind ourselves that it's a reflection in some ways of the deficiencies of Russia's defense industry today, the difficulties they're having after significant losses so far in the war against Ukraine and replenishing their stocks as well.
We know what Russia's original strategy was, which was to take Ukraine, and that the US does not believe he'll ever be able to do that because of the resistance and the effectiveness of the Ukrainian force. But the persistence, and John Kirby saying that now he wants to go beyond Donbass and go south and go west and approach Odessa. What do you think his current strategic goals are?
Putin's.
Putin's.
Maybe I'll take a step back just for a minute, if you'll indulge me, and talk a little bit about what at least we understand at CIA to be the mindset that animates Putin, because I've always found it's difficult to understand the tactical choices he makes, especially on such an incredibly important issue as Ukraine, without understanding that mindset. So, I've watched and dealt with Vladimir Putin for more than 2 decades now, and I've watched him stew in, what is a very combustible mix of grievance and ambition and insecurity. He's professionally trained to be a cynic about human nature. He is relentlessly suspicious, always attuned to vulnerabilities that he can take advantage of. He's not a big believer in the better angels in the human spirit. He's a big believer in control and intimidation and getting even. He really is an apostle of payback in a lot of ways. I say that because in my view anyway, all of those qualities have hardened over the course of the last decade. As his grip on power has tightened, as his circle of advisors has narrowed, his own personal sense of destiny and his appetite for risk has grown significantly over that time as well. And nowhere is that, and I guess what I would say on the issue of his narrowing circle of advisors, the reason I mention that is when I was ambassador in Moscow now more than a decade ago, there were still, fairly wide circles of people who Putin would listen to. Some of them would disagree with him sometimes. There's virtually none of that now. His very constrained circle of advisors either agrees strongly with him or has even harder views, and many of them are professionally trained like he was to have those views, or they've discovered a long time ago that it's not career enhancing to question his judgment. So I say all that because nowhere are those views harder than on Ukraine. And that's how I think we need to understand Putin's decision-making in the run-up to the war. He is convinced that his destiny as Russia's leader is to restore Russia as a great power. He believes the key to doing that is to recreate a sphere of influence in Russia's neighborhood, and he does not believe you can do that without controlling Ukraine and its choices. And so that's what produced, I think, this horrible war.
You were the last American official that we know of who sat across the table from Putin in November of last year, warning him against an invasion. Tell me about that, the dynamic there.
Well, I mean, what I would say first is that, we had been building from at least October of 2021, last October, a very troubling picture of what were quite detailed plans on Putin's part for a major new invasion of Ukraine. And what was most troubling in many ways across the U.S. intelligence community and working with, wonderful partners like MI6, and I know Richard Moore is here and is going to be speaking to you tomorrow. He's an exceptional friend and partner. But working together, we developed a very troubling intelligence picture. And so the president asked me to go to Moscow and lay out our serious concerns about that in an unusual amount of detail to President Putin and some of his closest advisors, and then to lay out the serious consequences that would unfold if he chose to execute that plan. I must admit I came away from those conversations even more troubled than when I arrived. Putin himself made no effort to deny the planning. And while my impression, the impression I conveyed back to the president when I got home, was that Putin hadn't yet made an irreversible decision to launch that invasion, he was clearly leaning hard in that direction at that point too. My further impression was he had convinced himself strategically that the window was closing for his ability to control Ukraine and its choices. That it wasn't so much a function of Ukraine in NATO, because he was smart enough to understand that formal Ukrainian membership in NATO at that time was at best a distant aspiration. It was more in a way about NATO in Ukraine, the movement that he could see and that Ukrainians were undertaking toward the West. But Putin really does believe his rhetoric, and I've heard him say this privately over the years, that Ukraine's not a real country. He believes that it's his entitlement, Russia's entitlement, to dominate Ukraine. And so that was the sort of strategic impression I took away. And then tactically, Putin and the people closest to him clearly believed they had a favorable landscape over this past winter. A Ukraine that they judged to be weak and divided that would fold quickly, a Russian military modernized to the point where they could win, in his view, a quick and decisive victory at minimal cost, European leaders whom he saw to be distracted by their own political transitions and the French elections that were coming up in the spring and risk averse. And he believed he had built a sanctions-proofed economy with a big war chest of hard currency reserves. He had failed, however, to tell his central bank governor he was going to war, and so many of those reserves were outside his control, outside of Russia as well. So that, produced, since each of those four assumptions were profoundly flawed, that helped to produce the catastrophic performance of the Russian military in the first phase of the war, the first 7 or 8 weeks.
Would you describe him as unstable, unhealthy?
No, there are lots of rumors about President Putin's health, and as far as we can tell, he's entirely too healthy.
Now, he went on to talk about how the United States has been sharing intel with the Ukrainians. I've been saying this for a long time. From what I can see when I'm on the ground in Ukraine, the U.S. is passing lots of signals intelligence to the Ukrainians, which is helping them know where to bomb, know what to bomb, and how to put their assets to best use. Take a listen.
The partnerships we built are effective ones, and we're sharing quite significant amounts of intelligence with the Ukrainian services and with the Ukrainian leadership that they're putting to very effective use.
Now, I talked about the casualty figures. Here, Bill Burns says that their estimate is somewhere around 15,000 dead and 3 times that wounded. That means 60,000 casualties total in 5 months of war. That is a absolutely brutal. Imagine if the United States went to war somewhere for 5 months and had 60,000 dead and wounded, 15,000 dead. That would be mind-boggling. In 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States lost somewhere around 12,000 total, and that was dead. But 20 years, not 5 months. So the Russians, this is not going well for Russia. And I think that Bill has some interesting things to say about the casualty figures. He also mentions that the Russians are adapting to the warfare, this new kind of warfare, and so the pace has slowed down. They're not losing as fast as they were at the beginning of the war because they've learned some things. But the Ukrainians have learned some things as well, and it's coming more close to parity as far as their combat power goes, as the Ukrainians capture and receive more tanks from the West, and bombs and bullets and planes and helicopters and everything else. And as the Russians lose men and materiel, they've come closer to a parity. So he says that the Russians have only advanced 6 to 10 miles in the last 90 days. And that's focusing all of their combat power on a fairly narrow band in the Donbass. That is really poor performance. That's very, very bad, actually. So I like to find those kinds of hard numbers that we can look at to get a sense for how things are going. Listen to this.
What is your estimate of the amount of casualties that Russia is sustaining?
Well, it's always a range, and there's no perfect number. I think the latest estimates from the U.S. intelligence community would be, something in the vicinity of 15,000 killed and maybe 3 times that wounded. So a quite significant set of losses, and the Ukrainians have suffered as well, probably a little less than that, but significant casualties.
Is the big picture that you think Russia is planning to dig in, keep hammering Ukraine, and believe that when winter comes and the fuel costs are so high on Europe that NATO solidarity will weaken?
Well, I'd say several things. First, after those catastrophic failures in the first phase of the war, the Russians and the Russian military have adapted. One of my recent conversations with one of my Ukrainian counterparts, he pointed out that the dumb Russians are all dead. And I think what he meant by that, at least what I took away, is that, in terms of their small unit tactics in the Donbass and elsewhere, the Russians have adapted. Certainly their leadership, Putin, has shrunk his objectives, at least for the time being. And I would stress, at least for the time being, he's concentrated their forces in the Donbass. And they're grinding away right now, making, as I think General Milley pointed out today, over the 90 days of this refocused effort in the Donbass, they've advanced, something like between 6 and 10 miles on a fairly narrow front. So it's come at great cost, and it's been very painful to both sides. But in a way, what the Russian military has done is retreat to a more comfortable way of war, in a sense, by using their advantages in long-range firepower to stand off and effectively destroy Ukrainian targets, and to compensate for the weaknesses in manpower that they still experience. And so in many ways it reminded me of what I saw as a young diplomat the first time I served in Russia in Chechnya in the 90s, the first Chechen war in the winter of 94-95, when the Russians and the Russian military encountered significant problems on the ground. They pulled back and leveled 40 square blocks in the center of Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. And as you look at the terrible scenes across Ukrainian towns and villages in the Donbass right now, you see a lot of that. It looks like a moonscape in some ways. But the Russians are able to make very slow progress in those areas. Now, the Ukrainians, their will remains quite strong. I hear this directly from them. We see this on the ground. They're being courageous and tenacious and quite skillful in using the weaponry that we and other allies supply, especially the HIMARS, the long-range missile artillery systems, which have been very effective against the Russian targets. Putin's bet, just as you said, Andrea, is that he can succeed in a grinding war of attrition, that they can wear down the Ukrainian military, that winter's coming, and so he can strangle the Ukrainian economy, he can wear down European publics and leaderships, and he can wear down the United States, because Putin's view of Americans is that we always suffer from attention deficit disorder, and we'll get distracted by something else.
All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed that, and we've got more coming. I'm heading to Panama on Tuesday, and so I will try to give you some good on-the-ground information about what's happening there once I get home. Looking forward to that, and looking forward to see you again. Thanks a lot.